My illness killed millions of people. I always thought my life was a routine journey from work to home, from raising our son to having evening tea with my husband. Thomas and I had been together for 10 years, and we had a wonderful son, David. We didn't have luxury, but we always found joy in simple things. Evenings on the couch in front of the TV, shared breakfasts on weekends, playing with our son in the yard, all of it seemed so routine yet beautiful. But one day, everything changed. The moment I received my diagnosis, I realized that my ordinary life would never be the same again. The doctor told me I had a severe illness, and I felt the ground slipping from beneath my feet. It was the moment when the world around me began to crumble into pieces. I saw it in Thomas's eyes, in his timid attempts to support me while he barely held himself together. I knew that we were all on the edge now, but I didn't know if I could stay strong for them. The illness progressed faster than we could have imagined. My once normal and safe routine became a series of medical appointments and tests. Each day brought new challenges, and each one seemed scarier than the last. I saw how hard it was for Thomas, how his constant anxiety ate away at our shared evenings, how he tried to be there and not show his fear. But I saw it. I saw his fear. Thomas and I started discussing treatment, and when the doctor quoted the cost, I felt the last bit of hope fading away. The treatment was so expensive that even in our dreams, we couldn't afford it. We began selling everything we could, but the money vanished faster than we could gather it. It was like trying to fill a bucket with holes, futile and painful. Thomas searched for alternatives. We tried borrowing, but everything seemed pointless. With each passing day, I felt the illness consuming me, and the fear for the future only grew. I looked at David and tried to understand how I could continue fighting, knowing that any victory might be short-lived. I saw my son trying to stay strong, even though he was only 9 years old, but his brave face only tore me apart inside. My family was my everything, but how could I help them when I felt powerless myself? We stayed together, holding on to the remnants of hope we still had, but each day became harder than the last. Our struggle with the illness turned into a fight for survival. I felt the world slowly falling apart around me, and I didn't know if I would find the strength to stay whole. Thomas was by my side, but his strength waned along with mine. We were like ships drifting in a stormy sea, without a compass and without a clear path. Sometimes it felt like I wouldn't be able to cope any longer. I looked at my husband and son and tried to hide my fear, but every time I was alone, all those emotions overwhelmed me like a wave. I tried to find strength within myself, but the fear for our future overshadowed everything. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on, and that scared me the most. Thomas was constantly searching for solutions. We tried to find cheaper treatments, reached out to charitable organizations, but each time the answer was the same. Without enough money, there was little chance. I watched him become more and more exhausted with each passing day, his hopes slowly fading. He was holding on for my sake, but I could see how difficult it was for him. Thomas had always been someone I could rely on. But now I felt that with each day, he was drifting further away from me. He spent nights discussing our options with friends and family, but each time he came home more depressed. I saw him trying not to show his despair, but he couldn't hide it. He was the one who always found a way out, but this time, like me, he was helpless in the face of the illness. David also started to notice the changes. He asked questions, but we tried to protect him from the worst news. We told him that Mom was just a little sick, but he wasn't as naive as we thought. I saw it in his eyes. He understood more than we wanted him to, and that hurt me even more. Each day became a trial for me. I felt my strength gradually leaving me. I could no longer be the strong woman I had always been. My emotions mixed with despair, and I could no longer control them. I cried at night while Thomas and David slept, afraid that they would see me so weak. I was lost in my fear and didn't know what to do next. The doctors talked to us about possible options, but each one seemed beyond our reach. We discussed taking out a large loan, but even that didn't guarantee success. I saw Thomas trying to find a way out each time, but he faced new obstacles every time. I tried to support him, but in reality, I needed support myself. Our life turned into an endless chain of challenges. Each day brought new trials, and each one became harder. I no longer felt confident about my future. Everything Thomas and I had built together now hung by a thread. We fought with all our might, but each day brought us more and more despair. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. Thomas was also becoming more and more exhausted. Our life, which once was so simple and peaceful, had now turned into a battlefield. And I didn't know if we could emerge from this fight as victors. I looked at my son and saw him becoming more and more silent. His joy was slowly fading, and it broke me into pieces. I wanted to give him back his childhood, but instead I was giving him only fear and uncertainty about the future. I wanted to be strong for him, but I didn't know if I could. Our family stayed together, but I felt us gradually falling apart. Thomas was drifting further away from me, and I was sinking deeper into my despair. We were together physically, but I felt that we were no longer the people we once were. I always thought my life would be like everyone else's. Thomas and I lived together for 10 years in a small house on the outskirts, raising our son David. We had a simple but happy life. We always sought joy in little things, without striving for luxury. Our evenings were spent with family, and weekends were filled with playing with David in the backyard. Life seemed stable and predictable. But everything changed the day I received my diagnosis. The news about the illness was like thunder on a clear day. I couldn't believe this was happening to me. The doctor said my illness was serious and required immediate treatment. It felt like my entire world came crashing down at that moment. Thomas, always so strong and reliable, now looked bewildered. He tried to stay optimistic, but I could see the fear in his eyes that he was trying to hide. We both understood that our life would never be the same again. The illness began to progress rapidly, and each new day brought even more challenges. The doctors stressed the need for immediate treatment, which was extraordinarily expensive. We started looking for funds for the treatment, but we realized our savings would not be enough. Thomas searched for any possibilities, but the situation became increasingly hopeless. I felt despair slowly consuming me, but I tried to hold on for the sake of my son. Every night, when Thomas and David fell asleep, I was left alone with my thoughts. All these emotions, fear and despair, squeezed me like a vice. I could no longer be strong as I used to be. Everything I knew and loved now hung by a thin thread. Each morning became a trial, new medical procedures, new tests, and each time new bills we couldn't afford. It was an endless cycle we couldn't escape from. Thomas continued to fight, but I saw him losing hope. He spent nights searching for solutions, discussing our options with friends and family, but each time he returned home more and more despondent. We tried to support each other, but in reality, we both needed support. Our struggle turned into a fight for survival. I no longer felt like the woman I used to be. My life now seemed like an endless battle for each day. We tried to protect David from this harsh reality, but he wasn't as naive as we thought. He sensed our anxieties and asked more and more questions to which we had no answers. His carefree childhood was gradually turning into a realm of fear and uncertainty. I tried to be strong for him, but I didn't know how much longer I could endure. Our life had turned into a battlefield, and I didn't know if we could emerge from it as victors. Each day, our world grew darker. We stayed together, but I felt us gradually falling apart. Thomas was drifting further away from me, and I was sinking deeper into my despair. We were no longer the happy family that cherished every moment of life. Our future was murky and uncertain. I no longer knew what to do. Our entire family found itself caught up in a whirlwind of events that no one could have predicted. The cost of my treatment turned out to be staggering. Each time we opened a new bill, it felt like we were being knocked down. The prices for medications, procedures, and consultations with doctors soared to unprecedented heights. Thomas and I began discussing what to do next. Our savings were dwindling by the day. While the bills kept coming, we realized that we couldn't continue like this. Despair forced us to make difficult decisions. We decided to sell everything of value we had. First, we sold items that had no special emotional value: furniture, appliances, jewelry. But that wasn't enough. Next, we were forced to sell the car that Thomas used to drive to work. He started using public transportation, which only added to his already heavy burden. After selling everything we could, we still didn't have enough money for the treatment. We then began reaching out to friends and family. It was a difficult moment, asking for help when you know everyone around you is also not in the best financial position. Friends tried to help as they could. Some donated small amounts of money, others provided items for sale, but it still wasn't enough. We felt hopeless like never before. I remember one evening when Thomas and I were sitting in the kitchen, trying to find any way out of the situation. At that moment, old photographs caught my eye, our shared pictures from times when everything was still good. These memories stirred up a lot of pain in me. I began to remember how we used to live, carefree and happy. We had planned our future, dreamed of travels and new adventures, but now all those dreams seemed so distant and unattainable. Each day brought new memories that highlighted the contrast between the past and the present. I remembered how Thomas and I first met, how he gave me my first bouquet of flowers, how we built our home from scratch, pouring all our love and hope into it. Now this home was filled only with fear and anxiety about the future. I felt something inside me breaking, but I held on to avoid collapsing in front of my son. Thomas tried to support me, but I could see how hard it was for him to keep up the facade of confidence. We were both on the brink of breaking down. Our relationship, which had once been strong, was now facing serious tests. We were no longer the couple that once built a future together. Now our future was murky and uncertain. During this period, I began to wonder what would come next. Could we ever escape this situation? How would David cope with it? Would we remain the family we once were? All these unanswered questions only added to our despair. I realized that our resources were nearly depleted, and we still had a long way to go. Thomas started working more, but it only drove us further apart. He came home late, and when he finally went to bed, I could hear him sighing quietly in the dark. I knew he was doing everything he could, but it wasn't enough. Sometimes it seemed to me that this illness had not only destroyed our lives, but also taken us away from each other. I could no longer find peace. Every time I looked at Thomas, I saw not the man I once knew, but a person worn out by an endless struggle. His eyes, which once sparkled with life, were now filled with exhaustion and despair. We were like two halves of a broken heart that could no longer find their way back to each other. Our son, David, also felt this burden. He was no longer the carefree boy he used to be. He saw us suffering, and although we tried to shield him, he understood everything. His questions became increasingly difficult, and I had no answers to some of them. He asked why this was happening to us, why his mom no longer smiled, and whether our lives would ever return to how they were before. Thomas was becoming more distant from me. We no longer talked as we used to. Our mutual support gradually turned into indifference. We were both so focused on survival that we forgot how to support each other. Our home had turned into a battleground where everyone was fighting their own demons. I remember when we first learned about the illness, how we cried together, promising each other that we would overcome it. Now those promises seemed like empty words. We no longer believed that everything would ever be right again. All these months of struggle had drained our last reserves of strength. My mother tried to help us financially, but her resources were also limited. She sold her old belongings to ease our situation, but it wasn't enough. We were grateful for her help, but each gesture only highlighted how dire our situation was. Every day became a test of endurance. We started living in a world where money was more important than any feelings. Every unpaid bill was another reminder of our hopelessness. We began to feel like strangers in our own lives. Our home, which had once been our refuge, now felt like a place of pain. I could no longer find peace within it. Every corner of the house reminded me of what we had lost. Things that once brought joy now became symbols of our despair. From time to time, I returned to memories of the past when things were different. I remembered how Thomas and I had planned our future together, how we built our dreams. Now those dreams had crumbled like a house of cards. I no longer believed we could return to our former life. One day I realized that we were on the brink. We had no more resources, and our hopes were gradually fading. We had lost everything that was once important to us. Our struggle had become about mere survival. Thomas and I were so exhausted that we no longer saw the point in what we were doing. This situation had turned our lives into an endless nightmare. We no longer lived. We merely existed. Each new day brought more challenges, and I didn't know if we could cope. Our lives had become a battle. Could we ever escape this situation? How would David cope with it? Would we remain the family we once were? All these unanswered questions only added to our despair. I realized that our resources were nearly depleted, and we still had a long way to go. Thomas started working more, but it only drove us further apart. He came home late, and when he finally went to bed, I could hear him sighing quietly in the dark. I knew he was doing everything he could, but it wasn't enough. Sometimes it seemed to me that this illness had not only destroyed our lives, but also taken us away from each other. I could no longer find peace. Every time I looked at Thomas, I saw not the man I once knew, but a person worn out by an endless struggle. His eyes, which once sparkled with life, were now filled with exhaustion and despair. We were like two halves of a broken heart that could no longer find their way back to each other. Our son, David, also felt this burden. He was no longer the carefree boy he used to be. He saw us suffering, and although we tried to shield him, he understood everything. His questions became increasingly difficult, and I had no answers to some of them. He asked why this was happening to us, why his mom no longer smiled, and whether our lives would ever return to how they were before. Thomas was becoming more distant from me. We no longer talked as we used to. Our mutual support gradually turned into indifference. We were both so focused on survival that we forgot how to support each other. Our home had turned into a battleground where everyone was fighting their own demons. I remember when we first learned about the illness, how we cried together, promising each other that we would overcome it. Now those promises seemed like empty words. We no longer believed that everything would ever be right again. All these months of struggle had drained our last reserves of strength. My mother tried to help us financially, but her resources were also limited. She sold her old belongings to ease our situation, but it wasn't enough. We were grateful for her help, but each gesture only highlighted how dire our situation was. Every day became a test of endurance. We started living in a world where money was more important than any feelings. Every unpaid bill was another reminder of our hopelessness. We began to feel like strangers in our own lives. Our home, which had once been our refuge, now felt like a place of pain. I could no longer find peace within it. Every corner of the house reminded me of what we had lost. Things that once brought joy now became symbols of our despair. From time to time, I returned to memories of the past when things were different. I remembered how Thomas and I had planned our future together, how we built our dreams. Now those dreams had crumbled like a house of cards. I no longer believed we could return to our former life. One day I realized that we were on the brink. We had no more resources and our hopes were gradually fading. We had lost everything that was once important to us. Our struggle had become about mere survival. Thomas and I were so exhausted that we no longer saw the point in what we were doing. This situation had turned our lives into an endless nightmare. We no longer lived, we merely existed. Each new day brought more challenges, and I didn't know if we could cope. Our lives had become a battle. Sometimes I would sit for hours in the darkness, trying to find some solution. But all I felt was helplessness. Thomas was also on the edge. He could no longer work as much as he used to. His health began to deteriorate due to constant stress and lack of sleep. We started discussing options we hadn't even considered before. One was to take out another loan, but we knew that would only worsen our situation. Another option was to seek help from charities, but we had already gone down that road and received only partial support. In these tough times, I found myself increasingly reminiscing about our past. I remembered how we dreamed of family vacations, how we wanted to see the world together with our son. But now these dreams seemed like something unreal. I could no longer imagine our future without this struggle. One day, Thomas told me he could no longer continue. He was exhausted both physically and emotionally. I watched him break down before my eyes and didn't know how to help him. Our relationship, which once was our support, had now turned into a source of pain. We could no longer support each other because each of us was focused only on our own struggles. David began to notice that something was wrong. He became more withdrawn and stopped interacting with his friends. It scared me because I didn't want him to lose his childhood because of our problems. but I didn't know how to talk to him about it. Every time he asked why we no longer spent time together, my heart ached. All these problems were gradually destroying our family. We were no longer the happy family we once were. Our home had become a place of constant tension where each of us felt alone in our own struggles. I no longer knew how to put things right. Our lives had changed so radically that I no longer recognized them. Each day brought new challenges, and I didn't know if we could overcome them. We had lost everything that once mattered to us: our home, our dreams, our family. Sometimes it felt like we had nothing left worth fighting for. My despair reached its peak when I realized that we could no longer even provide for the basics. We started cutting back on food, stopped buying new clothes, and even considered foregoing some medical procedures to save money. But all this only worsened our situation. This hopelessness was the most painful part of our struggle. We saw our lives falling apart, but couldn't do anything about it. We no longer believed we could overcome this crisis. Sometimes it felt like we were just waiting for the end, not knowing when it would come. Thomas and I began to avoid talking about the future. We no longer planned anything together because we saw no point in it. Our lives had turned into a struggle for survival, and we had lost all hope for better days. We were exhausted both physically and emotionally, and could no longer find the strength to keep fighting. Our shared memories, which once brought joy, had now become sources of pain. We recalled how we used to dream of a bright future, but now those dreams seemed distant and unattainable. We were no longer the couple who could support each other under any circumstances. With each passing day, our lives became harder, and we no longer knew how to cope. We had lost everything that was important to us and could not find a way out of this situation. Our family was on the brink of collapse, and we didn't know if we could survive this crisis. I remember one day Thomas told me he no longer believed we could be happy again. He said our dreams had been too big and life had been too harsh. These words struck me painfully because I felt the same way. We were both so exhausted that we could no longer find the strength to keep fighting. Sometimes it feels like we've long since lost ourselves. We have become completely different people, with nothing in common with who we once were. Our lives have turned into a series of trials that we can no longer endure. Our family is going through the hardest period of our lives, and I don't know if we can get out of this crisis. We have lost everything that once mattered to us and can no longer find meaning in what we are doing. But I know one thing: we must not give up, because that would mean we have lost everything. After I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, it felt like the world had stopped. The doctors said it was one of the most aggressive types of cancer, often diagnosed at advanced stages. I had no chance to catch the disease in its early stages, as I hadn't even suspected it had already consumed my body. They noted that the treatment would be difficult and lengthy, with minimal chances of a full recovery. The first days after the diagnosis were like being in a fog. I couldn't believe this was happening to me. Each day brought new pain, both physical and emotional. The pain grew stronger, and I could no longer control it. My strength was fading, and hope became more and more elusive. I looked at my son and felt life slipping through my fingers. It was hard to look at myself in the mirror. I saw a woman who was gradually losing her strength, her beauty, her vitality. I felt the disease tearing me apart from within, and it was the most terrifying experience of my life. At night, the pain became unbearable, and I couldn't find a comfortable position. Lying down, sitting, standing, all brought discomfort. I was troubled by fear. Fear of what would come next. Fear of not being able to see my son grow up. Thomas tried to be strong. He supported me in everything, but I could see how hard it was for him to endure this fight. Every time he looked at me, I saw despair in his eyes. We both understood that the situation was getting increasingly difficult, and I could no longer hide my fear from him. One of the most challenging parts of this process was the constant waiting. Waiting for test results, waiting for responses from doctors, waiting to see what would happen next. This waiting exhausted me more than the physical pain. Every time we went to the hospital, I felt my heart constrict with fear. I was afraid of hearing more bad news. Then one day, we were sitting in the doctor's office again. He was serious, even a bit sad. The doctor informed us that the treatment we had started a few months ago had not yielded the expected results. The disease continued to progress, and my chances of recovery were dwindling. It was another heavy piece of news that I had to accept. Thomas was silent, his gaze empty. He seemed completely shattered, but I knew he was trying to gather all his strength to support me. The doctor suggested an alternative option, experimental treatment that might help, but it was very risky. I didn't know what to say. It was the last chance, but it could be as dangerous as the disease itself. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in our home grew increasingly tense. We didn't know what to do or how to go on living. Thomas tried to keep everything under control, but I saw how hard it was for him. We both had lost hope but couldn't afford to stop. I remembered how happy we used to be, how Thomas and I would go for walks, dream about our future, laugh together. Now all that seemed distant and unreal. Our lives had turned into a constant struggle, and I no longer knew if we could survive this war. The physical pain was unbearable, but even more tormenting was the emotional pain. I felt the disease taking not only my strength, but also all my dreams, my future. I feared I would never see my son grow up, fall in love, or achieve success. I was afraid of leaving him alone in this cruel world. It was hard to see Thomas breaking under the weight of the situation. He became silent, withdrawn. We no longer communicated as we used to. Each of us was immersed in our own thoughts, our own fears. We felt our relationship gradually deteriorating under the pressure of this illness. Each day brought new trials. We were constantly under tension, afraid of the unknown. I couldn't find a place for myself. Every minute felt like an eternity. We didn't know where to find support or how to continue this fight. Our lives had turned into a constant hell with no way out. We discussed the possibility of experimental treatment. It was our only chance, but we knew it didn't guarantee success. It was a difficult decision that required immense strength from us. Thomas supported me, but I could feel how hard it was for him. We both feared making a mistake, but couldn't afford to stop. My physical condition worsened each day. I was losing strength, and the pain became increasingly unbearable. Sometimes it seemed like I couldn't endure it any longer, but I knew I had to fight for my family, for my son. In these tough days, I thought about my life. I remembered the times when I was happy, when everything seemed so simple and carefree, but now all that was left in the past. My dreams had shattered into 1,000 pieces, and I no longer knew if I could piece them back together. Each day became a new challenge for us. We tried to stay together, but our family was on the brink of collapse. We had lost everything that once mattered to us, and were now left alone with this illness. I no longer believed I could return my life to its former path. One day, the doctor informed us that the experimental treatment might start as early as next week. It was our last hope, but with it came fear. I didn't know if I could endure these new trials, but I knew I had to try. Thomas held my hand, his gaze serious and determined. We could no longer afford to doubt. The atmosphere in the house was tense. Every sound seemed too loud. Every minute dragged on endlessly. We were prepared for the worst, but hoped for the best. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew we would get through this together despite all the trials. I could no longer hide my fear. The thought that this might be our last chance terrified me. I saw how hard it was for Thomas, but he tried to hold on. We both knew the future was uncertain, but we couldn't allow ourselves to stop. I felt life slipping away from me with each passing day. Every piece of news we received from the doctors was like a blow to the heart. It was hard for me to accept that all our efforts, all these sacrifices, had yielded no results. My body no longer responded to the treatment, and although I tried to hold on, my strength was gradually fading. Thomas was also exhausted. I saw him becoming increasingly silent, starting to avoid discussions about the future. He was broken but tried to remain strong for my sake. I knew he no longer believed in a positive outcome, but he couldn't allow himself to admit it. And so, we sat again in the doctor's office. He offered an experimental treatment that might provide a chance for recovery, but the risks were extremely high. Thomas and I exchanged glances, and I felt a wave of fear rise within me. But we had no other option. I agreed to the experimental treatment, even though inside I was screaming with fear. I didn't know what to expect, but I understood this was our last chance. We returned home, and the atmosphere in the house became even more tense. Every sound seemed too loud. Every minute dragged on endlessly. We all lived in fear, waiting for what would come next. Thomas tried to stay strong, but I could see how hard it was for him. He held my hand, his gaze serious and determined, but I knew he was just as frightened as I was. We both understood that our future was uncertain, but we couldn't afford to stop. I could no longer hide my fear. The thought that this might be our last chance terrified me. I saw how hard it was for Thomas, but he tried to hold on. We both knew that the future was unknown, but we couldn't allow ourselves to stop. This entire struggle was draining my last reserves of strength. I felt as though my body was giving up, as if life was abandoning me. But I couldn't afford to break down. I had a family that I loved more than anything, and I knew I had to fight until the end, despite all the difficulties. When I look back on those months of struggle, I can hardly believe we made it through. The treatment we agreed to try truly saved me, but its cost was higher than we could have imagined. I began to gradually recover, but not just physically. My body slowly healed from the illness, but the stress and losses left a deep mark on our family. The first days after we learned the treatment was working were incredibly tough. I was exhausted, barely standing, and although I understood that my body was starting to recover, I couldn't feel joy. Thomas was also drained. We had lost so much along the way, our savings, our property, our peace of mind. But most importantly, we lost the illusion that everything would be okay. Life had changed us forever. We no longer had the luxury of living as we did before. The house that once was our fortress now felt empty and alien. We sold most of our possessions to pay for the treatment, leaving only the walls and essentials. It was a new beginning, but not the one we had imagined. Despite everything, I felt we were finally on the right path. My body continued to heal, and each new day brought us a little more hope. But even now, with most of the hardships behind us, we still feel the effects of that struggle. Our relationship with Thomas had changed. We had grown closer, but at the same time, we were exhausted, and it took a long time to feel like a whole family again. However, with all this, something new emerged. We found meaning in what we went through. We realized that material things no longer held the same significance they once did. We learned to value what we have, each other, our family, life itself. We began to see the world and our place in it differently. Having lost almost everything, we understood that the most important things cannot be bought with money. Our memories, our emotions, our support for each other, that's what helped us through these difficult times. Now we live more modestly, but with a greater awareness of each moment, each joy, each experience. It has been a long road, and it's not over yet. We will have to recover for a long time, both physically and emotionally. But now I know that we are capable of facing any challenges, that we can find strength in the toughest moments. And this faith helps me look forward with hope. I write this to share my experience with those who are currently struggling with their own difficulties. If you feel like you can't go on, that there's no point in continuing the fight, know that you have strength. Sometimes we don't realize how strong we are until we are on the brink. Share your story, support others, and you will see that you are not alone. Together, we can find new strength for life.